When historians describe medieval life as short, they often focus on mortality. But skeletal evidence tells a more precise and more unsettling story. Medieval people did not only die earlier. Their bodies began aging earlier, and the aging process progressed faster while they were still alive. This distinction matters, because it shifts the focus from death to deterioration. Across medieval Europe, osteological studies show a consistent pattern. Signs of physiological aging appear at ages that would be considered premature today. This is not inferred from written sources or artistic depictions. It is measured directly from bones, teeth, and growth markers preserved in burial populations dating from roughly the 11th to 15th centuries. One of the strongest indicators is the early appearance of degenerative changes. In skeletal samples from England, northern France, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia, researchers repeatedly find evidence of joint degeneration, vertebral wear, and chronic inflammation in individuals estimated to be in their 20s and 30s. In modern populations with access to basic infection control, similar levels of degeneration usually emerge decades later. The difference is not subtle. It is systematic. Importantly, this pattern does not correlate cleanly with occupation alone. While heavy labor increases mechanical stress, early degenerative changes appear even in individuals buried with indicators of relatively higher social status. This weakens the argument that medieval bodies aged faster simply because people worked harder. Instead, it points to a background condition affecting entire populations. That background condition was constant infection. Medieval environments exposed people to continuous microbial and parasitic load from early childhood onward. Water sources were frequently contaminated. Food storage was imperfect. Domestic animals lived in close proximity to humans. Minor wounds and skin infections were common and slow to heal. Most of these exposures were not immediately lethal, but they were persistent. From a biological standpoint, this distinction is critical. Acute illness triggers a temporary immune response, followed by recovery. Chronic exposure does something different. It keeps the immune system partially activated for long periods of time. Modern medical research shows that long-term immune activation accelerates aging by increasing inflammatory signaling, metabolic demand, and tissue breakdown. This process does not require dramatic disease. It operates quietly, as a constant drain on the body's maintenance systems. Dental evidence makes this visible. Examination of medieval skulls shows extremely high rates of dental abscesses and advanced tooth decay. These abscesses represent long-standing bacterial infections, often persisting for years. In modern clinical contexts, chronic oral infection is associated with systemic inflammation and accelerated deterioration across multiple body systems. Medieval individuals lived with these infections continuously, without effective treatment. Bone pathology reinforces the same conclusion. Periosteal lesions, which indicate repeated or unresolved inflammation of bone tissue, are common in medieval remains. These lesions appear even in individuals who did not die from infection. This suggests that infection was not simply a cause of death. It was a condition of life. Early life stress compounded the effect. Enamel hypoplasia, a defect in tooth enamel formation caused by physiological disruption during childhood, appears frequently in medieval populations. Each defect marks a period when growth was interrupted by illness or nutritional stress. Modern longitudinal studies demonstrate that individuals exposed to repeated physiological stress in childhood experience earlier onset of age-related decline later in life. Medieval children encountered these stressors repeatedly, and there was no protected recovery period to offset the damage. Life expectancy statistics often obscure this reality. While average life expectancy at birth was low due to high infant mortality, individuals who survived childhood could live into their 40s or 50s. However, skeletal aging does not align with chronological age. Many adults in their 40s display wear patterns more typical of much older individuals today. Survival did not mean prolonged physical resilience. The key insight of this evidence is not that medieval life was harsh. It is that medieval aging was accelerated by design of environment, not by singular catastrophe. Constant infection forced the body to prioritize defense over repair year after year. Energy that might otherwise support growth, regeneration, and long-term stability was diverted to survival. By early adulthood, many medieval bodies had already accumulated decades' worth of biological wear. Aging did not wait for old age to begin. It unfolded steadily from childhood onward, shaping what adulthood itself looked like. This foundation is essential, because it explains why later stressors, such as famine or epidemic, had such devastating effects. Medieval populations were not struck down from a position of biological reserve. They were already aging faster than their years. If accelerated aging in medieval populations was the outcome, then the mechanism lies in how the body allocates resources under constant biological pressure. The medieval body did not fail suddenly. It was slowly rebalanced toward survival at the expense of maintenance. In a healthy environment, the immune system operates in cycles. It activates, resolves a threat, and then returns to a low-activity state. This downtime is not optional. It allows tissues to repair, energy stores to recover, and cellular damage to be corrected. Aging is slowed not because damage never occurs, but because repair keeps pace. Medieval environments removed that downtime. Persistent exposure to pathogens meant that immune activation rarely shut off completely. Even when no acute illness was present, the body remained in a low-grade defensive state. Modern immunology shows that this kind of chronic activation is costly. Immune cells consume energy, inflammatory signaling increases metabolic demand, and repair processes are delayed or truncated. This trade-off is central. The body does not collapse under chronic infection. It adapts. But adaptation means reprioritization. Under constant immune demand, resources are redirected away from long-term upkeep. Tissue regeneration becomes less complete. Microdamage accumulates. Systems that rely on gradual renewal, such as connective tissue and vascular lining, deteriorate faster than they are restored. This does not produce immediate disability. It produces accelerated wear. At the cellular level, this state amplifies damage. Chronic inflammation increases oxidative stress, which harms DNA and cellular structures. Cells respond by entering senescence earlier. Senescent cells stop dividing and begin releasing inflammatory signals of their own. This creates a feedback loop. Inflammation promotes cellular aging, and aged cells promote further inflammation. Importantly, this process does not require severe disease. It functions under conditions of constant, low-intensity exposure. That is why it is difficult to detect without modern tools. Medieval people were not continuously bedridden. They were continuously paying biological costs. Another critical consequence is the erosion of physiological reserve. Reserve refers to the buffer between normal function and failure. In resilient bodies, reserve allows recovery after stress. In medieval environments, reserve was drawn down repeatedly and rarely replenished. Each infection, injury, or period of scarcity consumed capacity that was never fully restored. This explains a pattern frequently observed in historical records. Medieval individuals often declined rapidly after relatively minor stressors. A short illness, a modest wound, or a brief shortage of food could trigger disproportionate deterioration. The event itself was not extraordinary. The absence of reserve was. Early life exposure intensified this trajectory. Childhood is a period when immune regulation and metabolic efficiency are calibrated for life. Repeated immune activation during this window permanently alters baseline inflammatory responses. Modern longitudinal studies show that individuals exposed to chronic infection in early life age faster as adults, even when later conditions improve. Medieval children did not experience a later improvement. By adolescence, many had already accumulated years of unresolved immune stress. The body entered adulthood not from a position of surplus, but from a position of deficit. Aging, in this context, was not something that began later. It continued. Medical limitations reinforced the process. Without effective antimicrobial treatment, infections resolved slowly or incompletely. Symptoms might subside, but underlying inflammation often persisted. Survival was mistaken for recovery. The immune system carried unresolved burdens forward, stacking damage across decades. This produced bodies that were functional but fragile. People worked, married, and raised families while operating close to their physiological limits. There was little margin for error. When additional stress arrived, the system tipped quickly. What matters here is not any single disease or hardship. It is the cumulative effect of uninterrupted biological strain. The medieval body was not designed to rest at the cellular level. It was designed to endure. Accelerated aging, then, was not a malfunction. It was the predictable result of adaptation to an environment where infection never fully left. The body prioritized immediate survival and accepted faster deterioration as the price. This framework helps explain why medieval populations were so vulnerable to later shocks. Famine, epidemic, and environmental stress did not act on healthy systems. They acted on bodies that had already spent decades aging faster than their years. The mechanism was quiet, constant, and invisible to those living inside it. But its effects shaped the physical limits of an entire civilization. Accelerated aging in medieval Europe did not register as a problem to be solved. It became an assumption around which daily life was organized. When physical capacity declined earlier and more predictably, societies adjusted expectations of adulthood, productivity, and authority to match that reality. Aging faster did not disrupt civilization. It shaped it. Adulthood arrived early because the window of reliable physical capacity was short. Children entered productive roles as soon as they were capable. Apprenticeships often began in early adolescence, sometimes earlier, and full participation in labor followed soon after. This compression of life stages was not driven by cruelty or impatience. It reflected a practical understanding that strength, endurance, and resilience peaked early and could not be postponed. Marriage and family formation followed the same logic. Early marriage was not simply tradition. It ensured that households were established while bodies could still sustain work, reproduction, and caregiving. Waiting carried risk. If decline arrived before family structures were in place, survival became uncertain. Social norms aligned with biological timing rather than idealized longevity. Labor systems absorbed early aging by emphasizing replacement over preservation. Medieval economies did not expect decades of sustained peak output from individuals. They relied on rapid skill transfer and continuous influx of younger workers. Older individuals remained valuable, but their roles shifted. Experience, coordination, and authority replaced physical output. Decline was anticipated and accommodated rather than resisted. Authority structures evolved in parallel. Physical decline did not equate to loss of status. In many cases, it coincided with increased social power. Household heads, guild masters, elders, and council members were often individuals whose physical capacity had diminished, but whose experience had accumulated. Authority compensated for bodily decline. Social systems redistributed influence as strength faded, maintaining stability in populations that aged quickly. Perceptions of age differed fundamentally from modern ones. A person in their 40s was often considered old in functional terms, not metaphorical ones. Reduced stamina, chronic weakness, and limited endurance were common enough to be expected. Literary and legal sources refer to aging bodies without alarm. There was no expectation that vitality would extend far into later decades. Aging was visible, predictable, and socially integrated. Family structures buffered the consequences. Extended households distributed labor across age groups. Younger members carried physically demanding tasks. Older members contributed through supervision, memory, and authority. Dependency was not delayed. It was normalized. Survival depended on collective adaptation rather than individual longevity. Religious and moral frameworks reinforced acceptance. Early decline and physical deterioration were interpreted as inherent features of human existence, not as failures of environment or organization. Suffering was moralized rather than questioned. This interpretation reduced pressure for structural change. When decline is expected, it does not demand explanation or remedy. Crucially, there was no alternative reference point. Accelerated aging was universal. Without populations aging slowly, there was nothing to compare against. What modern observers identify as premature aging simply defined normal life. Only exceptional longevity stood out. The average trajectory passed without comment. This universality compressed the human timeline. Childhood was brief. Adulthood was intense and utilitarian. Old age, when reached, was often short and dependent. Social institutions evolved to function within this compressed arc. They were not designed to preserve bodies, but to extract continuity from rapid turnover. The long-term outcome was a civilization structured around biological depletion. Knowledge, authority, and labor were organized with the assumption that physical capacity would not last. Stability depended on succession rather than preservation. Medieval societies did not ignore human limits. They built systems that functioned within them. The most unsettling conclusion is that accelerated aging did not weaken medieval society. It made it efficient under constraint. Responsibility arrived early. Authority arrived as strength faded. Decline was not a crisis. It was a predictable stage. In medieval Europe, people did not expect their bodies to last. They expected them to be used while they could. That expectation shaped how life unfolded, how society was ordered, and how civilization endured under conditions of constant biological strain.